8th day, Middle Fire Month, 1 CE. All hail Falagrim Fielhammer. Agni's voice carried from the dais to the far end of the great hall, King of Khazar.
Hail to the king.
The voices of thousands of dark dwarves shook the air around Florine. King Fielhammer's coronation seemed a bit premature, but the success of his campaign to reclaim Khazar was all but set in stone.
And drenched in the blood of millions.
It was imagery that was most suitable for dark dwarves and their cruel ways. Except, in this case, the achievement was in no small part made possible by the Sorceress Kingdom. After realizing her blunder, Lady Shaltir hurriedly sent her Hanzo escorts out to collect any powerful gazers they could find in hopes that they had some useful information about the powerful Warhammer in Zul'Garenaria's possession. As a result, the tyranny-induced cohesion of the Gazer Hive completely collapsed and it fragmented into a multitude of factions that immediately turned on one another in each Gazer's respective bid for dominance over all others. Needless to say, the result was a trivial challenge for Clan Fielhammer to clean up. Complete victory over the invaders was merely a matter of time. As for Florine, she had more than her fill of dark dwarf society. She couldn't wait to get back to her work in the Abelian wilderness where people only killed other people because they needed to eat. The coronation ceremony made for a good point where she could gracefully part ways with her hosts. The proceedings were as characteristically brief as one might expect of dark dwarves. Nearly all of the attendees immediately left to return to their work as soon as it was over. Florine rose from the plain stone bench near the front that had been reserved for foreign dignitaries, taking an inventory of who was left. Even Queen Ba'owin went straight back to her office. Florine was fairly certain that the woman had joined the crowd on the way out. The king's son, Aldun, hadn't attended in favor of remaining at his command on the front lines. It was admirable, but in a way that only elder liches could fully appreciate.
Where to now? Velgarth asked as she came over to join her.
I was thinking that my work is done here, Your Royal Highness, Florine replied. The dwarf woman's lip curled. I'm glad you're getting lost if you're going to start calling me that. Ha! Don't let that sour act of hers fool you. Lord Deepingstone rolled up to join them. I've never seen the girl stick so close to anyone before. That's because it's my job, you fat bastard, Velgarth replied. Florine lowered her head in a curtsy. Lord Deepingstone, she smiled, it's a pleasure to see you alive and well after what happened in Grimmantle. Deep Wardens are tough buggers, Lord Deepingstone replied. It'd take more than that to put us down. I take it that means you're returning to the front? Aha. Though after everything's settled, I may just go on a little adventure. An adventure, my lord? I was thinking of going south with a bunch of my kin, Lord Deepingstone told her. If Falagrim can take Khazar the way he did, I figure I'd take the old hill dwarf country the same way. Since they're all dead, that makes me the heir to the place, yeah? I'll be counting on your Sorceress Kingdom for the muscle. The gate to the hill dwarf realm isn't far from my office in the Abelian Hills, Florine replied, so I would be delighted if you paid us a visit. When the last of the dark dwarves that remained after the coronation, they had all done so for work purposes, left, Florine made her way over to King Fielhammer on his plain stone throne. I'll be returning to the Sorceress Kingdom, Your Majesty. Got what you came for, huh? King Fielhammer said. When she had popped back up at Clan Fielhammer's base camp in Grimmantle, no one asked a single question about how she had survived. She got a disgusted snort from Velgarth and that was about it. It seemed, however, that they did suspect that she had the Fielhammer in her possession. Maybe they didn't confront her directly over it because they thought she would give them a whack. I can't say that I was very happy with what I found here, Florine said, but it was educational. I suppose that I should thank you for not trying to impose your strange ways on us, King Fielhammer said. I can only hope that things will stay that way. The Sorceress Kingdom hasn't meddled in the cultures of other nations, as far as I know. Florine turned to address Agni, her tone turning sympathetic. I'm sorry to hear what happened with Rayla, High Priestess. Our gods are a practical lot, Agni replied. Since Rayla's resurrection was refused, I can only believe that he served his purpose. I see. Forgive me if I committed any offense. Her only answer was a grunt. Cruel gods for a cruel people. The only good thing she could say about the Dark Dwarves was that everything about them was consistent. It was that quality in a culture that distilled the realities of the world into rigid societal forms that were probably the source of their success as a civilization.
But we can do better.
She had no doubt that they could. The Sorceress Kingdom was in a position where it could show a world full of abhorrent practices a far better way. As unpleasant as her time in Khazanah had been, she had come away with all sorts of information that would aid in that cause. After making sure there was nothing left behind in her stateroom, Florine took the rail network to Hada. Velgarth accompanied her party through the gate, which led to the same, unknown mountain valley from before. Isoroku's hand went to its temple and he cast a message spell. Florine stretched and took a deep breath of crisp air, liberated from the oppressive sensation of being kilometers underground. "You should come and visit us whenever you have the chance," Florine said.
"No thanks," Velgarth said.
"The surface makes my skin crawl. I don't know how anyone can live up here without having all of their hair fall out." A gate opened a few meters away. Lady Shiltir stepped through, accompanied by a pair of vampire brides. "Lady Shiltir," Florine lowered her head in a curtsy. "Good evening."
"Good evening," her liege replied. "I have the pleasure of introducing you to..."
Florine's words died in her mouth when she realized that Velgarth was already gone. "Never mind," she said. You, and you," Lady Shiltir pointed to Florine's companions.
"You're going back to the Abelian Hills."
"What about me?" Florine asked. "You've been summoned by the royal court," Lady Shiltir answered. "Albedo wanted to see you as soon as you got out." Leolio started making distressed noises once he realized that they were going to be separated. Lady Shiltir charmed the Maiku and told him to sit on Isoroku's head before sending them through another gate.
"I could have just convinced him to wait for me in the Abelian Hills," Florine said.
"Dominating people is far faster," Lady Shiltir told her.
"That's beside the point. I don't want him to hate you, my lady."
Lady Shiltir was so blunt about things that only Ludmilla would consider her courteous.
Still,
their liege managed to keep up her facade of high aristocracy with the other nobles through her sheer haughtiness. The cool mountain air was replaced by residual heat coming off of the pavement as they stepped through another gate to Erantal. As usual, the garden gazebo was surrounded by relative silence, with the bustle from the main promenade competing with a handful of insects chirping under the garden lampposts. Florine stopped in her tracks after they stepped out onto the street and Lady Shiltir went off in an unexpected direction. "Are we going elsewhere, my lady?" she asked.
"No," Lady Shiltir replied.
"I was in the middle of a delivery when you called. The royal court is holding audience at the royal villa as usual." Whether her liege was pleased or displeased about not being able to attend, she couldn't tell. Knowing her seeming obsession with doing work for the Sorcerer King, however, it was probably the former. Upon entering the royal villa, Florine found Lord Demiurge just inside the main doors. A blush crept onto her cheeks as the handsome devil smiled in greeting. "Lady Garnier," he bent forward slightly. "As always, it is a pleasure to see you." "Lord Demiurge," Florine smiled brightly in reply.
"It has been far too long."
Their steps echoed down the corridor as they made their way to the villa's great hall. Florine fought to keep herself from fidgeting nervously as she walked beside Lord Demiurge.
"This might sound a bit silly, my lord," she said, "but I never considered that you'd take the same way to the court."
Her blush deepened as Lord Demiurge's light laughter joined the sound of their footfalls.
"It would hardly be appropriate to crawl in through a window, wouldn't it?"
"Yes, of course," Florine joined him in his mirth. "I suppose that there are so many wondrous things about the Sorceress Kingdom that I can't help but think that there's always something more." "That may be true in some aspects," Lord Demiurge said, "but, in others, not so much. I'm sure you're more than well aware of that by now, my dear Baroness. Indeed, I'm certain that many of the steps that you follow are ones that I, too, have taken before." "He's so nice." Lord Demiurge was by far the nicest of the Sorcerer King's courtiers. Many of them were aloof, cold, and even condescending, but he was always a joy to interact with and never failed to assist her whenever she sought his aid. It wasn't just her, of course. Leanne had also benefited greatly from his knowledge and expertise in various matters. A pair of undead opened the way to the court chambers and Florine found Lady Albedo already present. Additionally, the royal treasurer was present, a curious fellow in a mustard uniform who went by the name of Pandora's Actor. She wasn't sure what race he was, Florine took her place at the table across the floor from the throne at the head of the hall, laying out her materials in preparation for the audience. "Thank you for your hard work, Baroness Gonnier," Lady Albedo opened in the custom of the Sorcerer King's closest confidants.
"It is an honor to serve His Majesty."
Florine lowered her head toward the empty throne at the head of the hall. She pushed a stack of 3 identical binders forward to the table's edge. Lady Epsilon, one of the Sorcerer King's senior royal maids, came to distribute them to the attending courtiers. Florine opened her own copy, flipping past the cover page to the index of her report. "Is there anything you'd like to say before we begin?"
Lady Albedo asked.
"I must apologize in advance for my lack of military knowledge, Lady Albedo," Florine said. "Much of my report concerning that aspect relies heavily on the feedback from our elder Lich sergeants. On that note, I'm concerned about the losses sustained by our least security forces. It was a mind-boggling number, comparable to what they had lost in the Draconic Kingdom. If one was told that the Sorceress Kingdom had lost dozens of country-destroying undead over the course of a single, brief campaign, they would wonder what sort of world-ending threat they had faced. It should be the expected outcome, no?" Lord Demiurge said, "Going by the reports from the elder Lich sergeants, I'd estimate that the gazer named Zul'Guraniaria was over difficulty rating 160 by adventurous standards." "That's still a shocking number, my lord," Florine said. "It implies that there are unknown entities as powerful as the demon gods lurking somewhere beneath our feet. Zul'Guraniaria was fleeing before a great shadow rising from the lower realms, so there are things even more powerful than that. According to my research," Pandora's actor said, "no one actually knows where the demon gods came from. Almost every credible account states that they appeared without warning. Coming from underground would not conflict with that narrative. So beings like Zul'Guraniaria appeared on the surface in the past, becoming what we know as the demon gods? And this great shadow is something like the demon god king? An intriguing prospect, isn't it?" Pandora's actor said, "The histories of this region have clearly been distorted in various ways, shaped according to limited perception and cultural biases. In particular," Lord Demiurge added, "the humans of this region are curiously willful when it comes to their interpretation of events. What does not fall in line with their understanding is forcefully made to do so, becoming demons, gods, or whatever else they fancy. But we digress. His Majesty will decide how this matter will be addressed. The matter of undead losses does merit consideration, however," the royal treasurer said. "Khazanar's losses are more than easily sustainable, but, attractive as the revenues might be, having 1,000 clients doing the same thing would be untenable. Servitors are created to be used," Lord Demiurge seemed to shrug. "One could also say that this is the best way to use our Death Series servitors. The Sorceress Kingdom cannot be everywhere at once. Clients like Khazanar double as an early warning system against threats that demand our attention. I would dare see this as one of the reasons that Lord Ines wishes to distribute the undead far and wide. We should still ensure that the least undead aren't wastefully employed," Lady Albedo said. "The elder Lich sergeants are a safeguard against that, but they will still do their best to carry out the commands of the client. The existence of fools that would throw away their own soldiers, never mind the undead, for frivolous reasons is guaranteed, so we should consider additional clauses to the lease agreement to safeguard against them." Florine nodded silently in agreement, recalling her unpleasant encounter with Lord Reynaldo at her Robelais border. "Moving on," Lady Albedo said. "Your report places a heavy emphasis on the workings of Khazanar's institutions and the societal mechanisms that maintain what they establish. Are you certain that their methods can be adapted to the Sorceress Kingdom?" For some reason, the image of Director Alpha brandishing a whip popped up in her head. It was strangely fitting, considering her usual approach to instruction, but she didn't think many people would survive it. While many of their methods would be unacceptable, and outright illegal, in the Sorceress Kingdom, my lady, Florine replied, I believe that the broad concept of national institutions that they've implemented is sound. It is far more promising than the route taken by the Baharuth Empire. If anything, the Empire's methods are mostly the same as everywhere else, and what sets them apart is extremely wasteful when it comes to harnessing the full potential of a population. This was especially the case for the Sorceress Kingdom, which was currently trying to convert the majority of its citizenry into a labor force for secondary industries. There was absolutely no way that hundreds of thousands, millions if one counted the tribal demi-human population, could rise on personal merit when the educational infrastructure didn't exist to facilitate it.
This is an expensive proposition, the Royal Treasurer said as he flipped through the report. You'll have to ensure that your curriculum is effective before we can fund it on a national scale. Are the facilities constructed in Corlin Harbour sufficient for the task?
They are, my lord, Florine nodded, but Countess Corlin projects that our methods will take decades to refine and what we implement on a wider scale will be incremental. The bulk of our focus is on primary education to address our poor literacy rates and lack of mathematical knowledge. This is probably one of the major points where our system differs from all others that we've come across. Every other place focuses on producing productive individuals as quickly as possible.
That does seem like the most efficient route.
Why have you decided to deviate from what the countries in the region have settled on?
Countess Corlin did most of the planning for our new curriculums, Florine replied, but were mostly agreed upon the rationale for her decisions.
First and foremost, high literacy rates make the transmission of ideas easier. This helps us not only with educational standards, but will also allow us to communicate more effectively with our students throughout their lives and cultivate a national character for the Sorceress Kingdom that transcends racial boundaries.
Secondly,
the way that the current known systems force individuals onto a specific career path is fundamentally a gamble. For instance, it assumes that the child of a merchant will naturally also be a merchant. This is already problematic in the sense that our inheritance laws leave heirs with uncertain futures. Our time in the Sorceress Kingdom has also opened our eyes to the reality of how things work. Incorporating what we do in our primary education will allow our students to explore the possibilities that are available to them. More than anything else that came with the Sorceress Kingdom, Florine felt that this was the most revolutionary concept. The things that were included in their curriculum's primary education were formerly only afforded to the privileged few. Together, they represented a next to unbreachable boundary that separated one world from another. Your optimism blinds you to the problems that come with education, Albedo said. Knowledge opens doors that are difficult to close. Knowing where one stands in life can be a source of discontent among mortals.
At worst, it can be used as a weapon against those in power.
If the Sorceress Kingdom offers the highest standard of living in the world,
Florine said, there can hardly be any reasonable justification for what you warn against.
The benefits of an educated population will far outweigh the detriments in every aspect.
I agree, Lord Demiurge said. The degree of happiness that those under His Majesty enjoy relative to the rest of the world will be made evident eventually.
We shall see, I suppose.
Lady Albedo leafed through the pages of the report.
Of more immediate interest are these logistical innovations you observed in Kazana.
You seem to focus far less on technological aspects than societal ones.
That's because their implementation is relatively simple. As with our other logistical innovations, they are pieced out of concepts that we already understand. I know that Countess Wagner will vehemently disagree with me over the technicalities, but that's how most people will see things. We can even come up with reasonable predictions for their economic effects. Staying ahead of the societal changes that these innovations bring is far more difficult and infinitely more important.
You almost sound like Countess Corlin, Lady Albedo said.
She's not wrong, Florine told her. Even the most progressive of nobles are highly sensitive to those aspects of society. Countess Corlin also believes that culture is central to advanced job class development.
I've read her thesis on the subject, Lady Albedo told her. I believe that is all that we wish to cover for this audience. Expect further inquiries once your report receives a thorough review.
Florine lowered her head in acknowledgement.
Yes, Lady Albedo. Before I return to the Abelian wilderness, might I inquire about the matter with Roblé?
Foreign Affairs has dispatched several agents to take a closer look at what's going on internally,
Lord Demiurge said. They were dispatched shortly after the incident at the border, so it should be some time yet before we receive enough relevant information to draw preliminary conclusions with.
On that note, may I ask how you inferred everything that you did in your report about the Holy Kingdom?
The signs were very clear to those who have the senses to perceive them, my lord, Florine replied. The Minister of Foreign Affairs exchanged looks with the Prime Minister.
I suppose we'll have to add that to our list of known job class abilities, Lord Demiurge said. It does make me wonder why Roblé's administrators haven't noticed, however.
Without enough information to conduct an audit, Florine said, the ability is only useful when directly exposed to the problem.
I don't derive any joy from speaking poorly of others, but I can only think that the administrators that have been exposed to the problem are exploiting it to their own ends, exacerbating the worsening situation in the kingdom of Roble. How very unfortunate. This is something that I might have expected out of Riestais, but the Holy Kingdom? After everything they've gone through. Lord Demiurge sadly shook his head. He truly was a kind man. If I didn't know any better, Albedo said, I would swear that the woman enjoys playing with fire. And that race change item, is it so hard to collect 10 souls? She's gone through 2 wars with millions of casualties each. 2. In the entry hall of Nazaric's guild treasury, Pandora's actor walked alongside Albedo and Demiurge on their way to the inner chambers. He mused over how rare it was to see the 3 great minds of Nazaric's NPCs together in such a setting, but the reason wasn't exactly profound. They were simply going from one meeting to the next. A chuckle rose from Pandora's actor's throat as the Guardian Overseer's tone grew increasingly vexed. Might I ask what amuses you? Albedo asked. It's just that, while you're of the mind that Lady Gonye is playing with fire, I, on the other hand, can only wonder how many times our dear Demiurge has come so close to being burned. That report of hers was written with uncanny accuracy. The specific details aside, she pretty much summarized everything that you've been up to in the Holy Kingdom of Roble just by spending a day at the border. The Archdevil's face lit up into a smile as he seemed to join in on Pandora's actor's mirth. I hope you don't plan on doing anything untoward to her, Pandora's actor said. She represents a substantial investment on Nazaric's part, after all. Perish the thought. Demiurge replied, on the contrary, I find myself growing fond of our earnest immortal in training. There are so very few who have developed a true appreciation for my work. Slightly ahead of them, Pandora's actor sensed a souring in the Guardian Overseer's mood. He supposed it couldn't be helped. While Demiurge was making all of Roble dance to his tune, Albedo's work in Riestais seemed to be about as enjoyable as a swim in the black capsule. As they entered the chamber where Pandora's actor originally stood guard, a sense of reverence fell over them. Albedo genuflected, he and Demiurge followed suit. Before them, sitting on the couch in front of the chamber's lone table, was the supreme overlord of Nazaric, Ein Zulgaun. Ein Summer, Albedo said. Thank you for taking the time to see us on such short notice. Umu. Pandora's actor raised his head, looking up in awe at his creator's regal figure. He was surrounded by a dark, brooding air that suited him perfectly. In his skeletal hand, he held the warhammer recovered from Khazana, which glowed with a cool light. The mere existence of that weapon had put all of Nazaric into the highest alert status it had been in since its arrival in their new world. In Yggdrasil, equipment was not categorized by level, but by total use data capacity, which was in turn determined by the materials used for the item frame. Put simply, it was not just legendary and divine class items that were used by level 100 players, but also legacy and relic class items if they weren't as fabulous as the supreme beings. The weapon in his master's hand was a legendary class item, which made being the former possession of a level 100 player a near certainty. The weapon wobbled in his master's hand as Albedo sat down beside him and pressed herself against him. Pandora quickly went over to sit down and press in from the other side. Albedo glared daggers at Pandora's actor as she hugged Ein Summer's arm, but he refused to give up any ground. An eternity passed in silence. A blissful eternity at Ein Summer's side. Then Ein Summer rose and paced slowly about the room, tapping the warhammer on his palm. Have we detected anyone attempting to retrieve this weapon? Ein Summer asked. No, Ein Summer, Albedo answered. There have been no overt signs of intrusion in the vicinity of Nazaric since the weapon's arrival. What about Shiltir? She should have been the last person seen with the weapon in her possession. She's been continuing her deliveries to the Abelian Hills without incident. If I may ask, Ein Summer, how shall we categorize the threat? Since it's a legendary class weapon, it should be a player below. Ein Summer stopped, placing the warhammer on the table in front of the couch. That would be foolish, he said. This weapon is built for a tank, and tanks prioritize their defensive equipment first. They could have a divine class shield, or divine class armor as you do. Forgive me for rushing to conclusions, Ein Summer. Pandora's actor could sympathize with her, somewhat. While Ein Summer always claimed that it was possible,
Categorizing a player in the same bracket as one of the supreme beings still felt like blasphemy. "What have you learned about this item?" Ein Summer asked. "It was in the possession of a gazer," Albedo answered. "According to Shiltier, it wasn't very strong. We've interrogated a few of the gazer's associates and they only seem to know that it exists and only make guesses at its properties. There is another lead, however. The Dark Dwarves refer to the weapon as the Feelhammer and it appears to be the namesake of the clan that's leasing undead security forces from us." "Well, that is what the creator named it. How old is this Dark Dwarf clan?" "They recall the 8 Greed Kings as an event that didn't touch their territories, so well over 5 centuries old. They claim to have migrated from a dwarven empire in another part of the world." In that case, the wielder of this weapon should have died from old age. Assuming that they were a dark dwarf related to this clan's founding. "In that case, shall we lower the alert level, Ein Summer?" "That might be for the best. At least it made for a good drill." "What about the shadow that was mentioned?" "We have even less information about that than the weapon," Albedo replied. "Troops have been stationed at the entrance of every known cavern of unknown depth, but we still have no clue where this Khazanar is. Even after going to the entrance personally, Negreda was unable to discern its location and only came away with theories about how it works." "Tell her to keep working on it," Ein Summer ordered. "That's just the sort of edge Nazarick needs over other players." "Yes, Ein Summer." Demiurge rose from his seat across the table from Albedo. "Ein Summer, if I may speak?" Their master clasped his hands behind his back and turned to regard Demiurge. "I will permit it." The existence of this underground realm presents another vector that we must consider for Ein Summer's goal of world conquest. It presents various challenges that would drastically set back our current timetable if we devoted any resources to it. "And what would you propose?" Demiurge let out a self-deprecating chuckle. "I only meant to express my admiration for your foresight, Ein Summer. The plan that you have in place is, as expected, more than sufficient." My plan? Indeed. Demiurge grinned. "While I did expect some minor discoveries from the Dark Dwarves, I never fathomed where our association with them would truly lead. That you foresaw their need before we even encountered them, truly, your unfathomable intellect knows no bounds." "Oh." Pandora's actor looked up at his creator, gaze filled with admiration. Their eyes met for a split second before sadly parting again. Ein Summer cleared his throat. "Speaking of plans, what will you be doing next?" "I am currently still in the preparatory phases for several schemes in various places, Ein Summer." Demiurge straightened his tie. "If you desire something more interesting, we are ready to push through phase 2 in the Holy Kingdom of Roblay. I, for one, cannot wait to see how the pawn you've prepared for us there will perform." "Is that so? Well, be sure to keep me apprised of any significant developments." Stone and Blood, afterward. That was a relatively short one, at least by this series' standards. Thank you, dear reader, for your continued interest in Valkyrie's Shadow. Where did the afterword for The Tiger and the Dragon go? The Tiger and the Dragon was written as 2 volumes, the usual updates in the Sorceress Kingdom, and the Soraka introduction divided by the lighter intermission with Nemel. The first volume was uneventful in terms of reader commentary, but the second volume, with its philosophical exploration of the Draconic Kingdom, Roland Gork, and the Beastman Confederacy sparked a surprising amount of discussion. I can already imagine more than a few people thinking obviously, but I would argue that the people who were mentally blue-screening at the portrayal of those societies are in the minority. Rather than alien, the perspectives presented use the same foundations that over 4 billion people on Earth, yes, the one that you live on, have built their societies on, though modified to fit into the new world setting. At a certain point in the reader commentary during The Tiger and the Dragon, it became quite disturbing that some could shut down their brains and make things up out of nothing, claiming that what they fabricated was what was written. It sort of felt like I was thrown back to the colonial era, with the comments being made by people from colonial powers so insufferably assured of the superiority of their own cultures and moral values utterly failed to understand what they observed in the rest of the world and made up the craziest things in the vacuum. I suppose it could be considered a testament to how distinctly written the characters and societies in The Tiger and the Dragon were. However, it's clear that 2 volumes weren't enough to explore the more alien supposedly parts of the setting. That's fine though, since there's more of it to come in the future.
Until then, I will refrain from adding author's notes on those subjects since they may prematurely spoil the experience. Where did you go? I've been traveling a lot for various projects since the new year, and I'm still out there somewhere. The last time that I participated in any reader discussion was back near the start of this volume. Most of my travels take me to places with shitty to no internet, so I've just scheduled a crapton of chapters in advance. Before you say Starlink, it hasn't been approved here yet. Hopefully, I haven't screwed up somewhere with chapter scheduling, but I'll be back to civilization soon enough to check. Anyway, on to the notes for the volume. Differences in philosophy. I've noted some accusations of sameness between the members of the Noble Quartet, even to the point where they've been coined a lesbian hive mind. This is something that I've never understood, as I've made sure to present Ludmilla, Clara, Leanne, and Florine as unique individuals with very different perspectives and approaches to life. At some point, I simply gave up thinking about it and decided that some people can't discern differences in character unless an argument between Florine and Leanne over a cute boy ends with Leanne clubbing her best friend in the back of the head with a monkey wrench. All I can really say about that is this story isn't written like some sort of reality show. The world doesn't stop turning because one character realizes that another character holds a different opinion, and people work out their differences in a manner befitting their station and the situation that they find themselves in. With the Noble Quartet, overt character conflict only happens when they're in casual mode. It has happened in previous volumes and happens again in Act 1 of Stone and Blood. What was surprising this time was that there were comments about Ludmilla becoming dumber or changing from her original portrayal. And to that, I say, huh? To make it perfectly clear, and I believe that this was mentioned in the afterword of Birthright, Ludmilla's initial portrayal was that of a naive teenager who is more book-smart than street-smart when it comes to territorial administration and local politics. In short, she was written to be what some might consider stupid at first, something like a student taking their first steps out into the real world. Now, she's far smarter, having gained a mountain of experience, job class growth, and the confidence to tackle the issues that she considers important. Ludmilla's stance on various aspects of kingdom building has always been expressed through her territorial policies and military thinking in previous volumes. Act 1 of Stone and Blood is the first time she tries to frame that stance comprehensively. And it's confusing. Because it's meant to be confusing. Why is that? Mostly because I write things to be both true to character and setting in Valkyrie's shadow. In her region of the New World, the vocabulary that you and I might use to explain what she's trying to does not exist, and the concepts that she is trying to cover similarly have no formal terminology. As a result, Ludmilla must resort to analogies and anecdotes in an attempt to get her point across. It should also be noted that this ties into the exploration of linguistics and communication in the New World and how language frames thought and action. By extension, it also serves to point out how the existence of a simplistic auto-translation mechanism in the New World continually sabotages its denizens in many ways. A world where the vast majority of people only hear what they already understand is a hellhole of echo chambers. At the core of the difference between herself and her friends is Ludmilla's existence as a ranger through her revenant racial class levels. Rangers and druids have always existed as a champion or at least a component of natural order in traditional fantasy. They have the fantasy version of Earth system science built into their classes and also have a working knowledge of what we on Earth currently consider complex systems theory. How Ludmilla has applied this to other fields has also been shown in previous volumes, though I suppose it might not have clicked back then. Her thinking isn't linear, mechanistic, or superficially structured around relationships between different things. That type of thinking is anachronistic projection on the part of the reader. It is modern thinking that has become entrenched in 21st century common sense, though the philosophical framework for modern common sense is fundamentally unchanged from its emergence during the Industrial Revolution. Instead of that, Ludmilla's thought processes tend to factor in the intricate matrix of feedback loops that form the world around her, and the way that she investigates the world and takes action within it is indicative of her thought processes. For those who are still confused about what Ludmilla was trying to express to Florine, it was not about economics, it was the fact that she functions under a completely different philosophical framework than her friends and most humans in the region did. This, in turn, affects how she sees everything, including things like economic modeling. In this case, the existing economic model was simply the example that Ludmilla settled on because it just happened to be the source of the friction in the incident with Leon, and she thought that she could relate to Florine better by using it. On a related note, the perspectives and value systems of most of the tribal cultures explored in Valkyrie's Shadow are the way that they are because they are dominated by druids and rangers, mystics and hunters. I've seen a few comments about how there's some sort of pro-nature platform or the promotion of a noble savage ideal in this story, but that is what I've frequently referred to as an externality that some readers insist on not only forcing into their interpretation of the story, but also try to tell everyone else is what's going on. Aside from player influence like the fantasy Buddhism that somehow entrenched itself in the Beastman Confederation, these people and societies are the product of their native setting. Many things in the writing may reflect various real-world issues, conflicts, concepts, or even people, but they are built out of the setting rather than forcefully injected out of the desire to promote some agenda. I'm sure there will still be those who insist that the latter is the case, however. In this case, it almost seems as if there's a subset of the readership that takes anything that detours from what they consider advancement as savagery or even anarcho-primitivism. Perhaps the most amusing, and mind-boggling, instance was when Vltava pointed out that an entire civilization relying on a single monoculture would inevitably get owned by something that negatively affects that monoculture, and a handful of people decided that he was saying return to monk. As stated multiple times in the past, Valkyrie's Shadow presents characters that are not reader inserts in a world that is, well, its own world. Readers that insist on attempting to self-insert or force what is presented into whatever their version of common sense is only do themselves a disservice and probably blind themselves to 2/3 of the story in the process. Yaldabaoth's Shadow. Way back in Winter's Crown, Yaldabaoth had a little bit of work done in the Abelian Hills before his stroll through half of the Holy Kingdom. Some of the effects of that work were immediate, such as the internment camps and their associated genocides, the Happy Farm, and the forced migrations, one of which we followed headfirst into the upper reaches. Others, however, still affect events in the story to this day and will continue to do so in the future. Stone and Blood includes several echoes from the past, including the arrival of Qrs Ganzu's tribe in Ludmilla's domain. It turns out that his wife and 2 of his daughters survived the battle at the ford in Winter's Crown. His son, Dull, who met Ainz in Volume 12 of Overlord, serves as a sort of liaison between Ludmilla and his tribe. Fortunately for them, Ludmilla doesn't hold anything against Qrs for threatening Warden's Vale and even feels guilty about being unable to reunite him with his family. To make amends, she immediately enacts measures to get his tribe back on its feet. As with so many things, Demiurge uses his power to create problems that cannot be fixed by power. I suppose that some may consider that a mark of his genius. Like the Ganzu tribe, many of Abelian's remaining tribes are left shattered and their populations are suffering from various renditions of PTSD. To make things even worse, they've been force relocated by the Sorceress Kingdom in the administration's desire to order things to their liking. At least they weren't eradicated to make room for a highway, I suppose. It doesn't stop there, however. In the West, we find that the Holy Kingdom of Roble is going downhill fast under the guidance of their new Holy King. That is a story for a different volume, however. The Abelian Special Administrative Area. In canon, Ainz promptly dumps responsibility for Abelian Hills on Albedo's lap. I'm sure more than a few readers envision Death Knights being stationed everywhere and everything being peaceful, productive, and perfect, but that's not how things work in this story. The place is way too huge to have Death Knights everywhere. There are countless tribes of different races still living in the region, and the behaviors that once sustained them are illegal in the Sorceress Kingdom. Now what? Conveniently, a certain demon emperor was hard at work preparing the way for the Sorceress Kingdom's eventual control over the area. Many of the problematic species have already been exterminated through a program of brutal captivity and experimentation, capped off by the two-way genocide that was the invasion of the Holy Kingdom of Roble. For those that managed to survive to become citizens of the Sorceress Kingdom, there was a giant ass war in the Draconic Kingdom that just so happened to provide them with sustenance for the time being. Things can't go on forever like that, however, so the increasingly short-staffed and ever more annoyed with stuff in Riastais Albedo sends Florine Garnier to sort things out and get the mechanisms of civilization going in the Abelian wilderness. It's far from Florine's first time working with tribal demi-humans, but this time she goes into her job with more than simply setting up a network of trade posts in mind.
Her time with Ludmilla has made her far more conscious of the fact that her idea of civilization may not really make sense for members of other races, and she is swiftly introduced to many examples that drive that reality home. There are races that evolved to develop mutualistic relationships with another species left lost due to the purposeful eradication of their partner species. Others only want to be left alone, and many don't care about commerce. Some of them are incapable of caring about money and don't even share the same fundamental realities as other species. There are creatures who are more magical than biological, and many to whom many of the laws of the sorceress kingdom cannot be applied. Even for those to whom the law can be applied, troubles immediately manifest, as the denizens of Roblé hold no qualms about exploiting the arbitrary terms of a treaty between civilized states, assured that there can no longer be any violent reprisal for their actions. Fortunately, Florine comes around to ensure those problems are addressed before too much damage is done. Unfortunately, Roblé is not her jurisdiction, so there's nothing she can do about what's going on over there. As for the rest, it's a work in progress. Her work there will definitely have her coming out with many new perspectives on the world far removed from her human one, which may just be what Albedo was really aiming for. The Dark Dwarves. Another character introduced back in Winter's Crown, Felagrim Feelhammer is revisited once since then, and his more permanent appearance in Stone and Blood. For some reason, people thought that Demiurge was going to do something to him when he came around to sell his stuff. I suppose that did happen, since Felagrim made a killing equipping the demi-human coalition before it met its end in Roblé. As many quickly noted, the Dark Dwarves in Valkyrie's Shadow are essentially Duergar. How did I come to the decision to use them? Well, before the Overlord light novel, the web novel had a little snippet about the Dark Dwarves in the Abelian Hills. Others include Dark Dwarves, and in exchange for Goblin, Ogre and Orc slaves, they provide metal arms for the war. There was a nod to this in the author's notes of Overlord Volume 12, which mentions that Bissa got his gear from the Dark Dwarves. On a side note, the Hill Dwarves are also mentioned in the web novel, occupying the area under the Abelian Hills and getting their asses kicked sometime before Nazaric's arrival. Florine goes through some of the ruins of their country in Valkyrie's Shadow. Hill Dwarves having racial ranger aptitudes is also canon, as mentioned in KBA. Additionally, the iceberging in Volume 11 of Overlord suggests that the New World has a classic Underdark setting that many Western fantasy fans are familiar with. Most of Ainz's adventure in the Mountain Dwarf realm took place underground in the Upper Realms. It's a stupidly dangerous place for surface dwellers and even has species with psionic capabilities. When you throw that all together, you get, well, Duergar. A nasty, evil race of dwarves with latent psionic capabilities that build their massive slave empires in the Underdark realms below. Felagrim is something of an exemplar of his race, bleak, cynical, and coldly utilitarian. He lives to work and finds no joy in it. The only sense of superficial joy or entertainment that Dark Dwarves appreciate is when they're making others suffer and when they're butchering their enemies. His entire family is like that, as is most of his kin. The sole exceptions come from the Deepingstone clan, who still have strong traces of Hill Dwarf blood in them. In terms of governance, the principalities of Khazan share a similarity with the clans of Rolengork in the fact that they are elective monarchies, and each monarch is seated on a council that, in theory, manages the realm's collective interests. This form of government is rare in fantasy writing, but it is historically the most common form of monarchy on Earth. I suppose the notion isn't as romantic as the tropey form of hereditary monarchy that is so often portrayed. The Dark Dwarves' entire civilization would be considered lawful evil to TTRPG players, and they're the fifth lawful evil society to be presented in Valkyrie's Shadow after the Sorceress Kingdom, Facet County representing the lawful evil elements of Riastais, the Goblin Army of Winter's Crown, the Frost Giants, and a good chunk of the Baharuth Empire. As you may have noticed by now, lawful evil isn't only characterized in one way. On slavery in the New World, the Tiger and the Dragon had plenty of murmurings on this, and I assume that those murmurings will come out in full force in Stone and Blood. In short, it feels like a number of active commenters have a severe case of recency bias when it comes to the institution of slavery, pretty much only considering the slavery that occurred during the colonial era in Earth's history. I'm no supporter of slavery, but parroted statements like slavery stifles innovation and slavery is economically uncompetitive conveniently ignore what qualifies those statements. During Earth's colonial era,
This was true because slave owners made decisions based on their desire to uphold the institution of slavery, which caused them to reject the innovations brought about by industrialization and the revolutionary technological progress of their time. This, in turn, made them uncompetitive because they were no longer efficiently or effectively running a business, but instead defending an establishment that was becoming irrefutably obsolete. What made slavery obsolete in our world cannot do the same thing in the New World setting of Overlord. The limit of non-specialized labor, aka crafting without job class levels, is ultimately mundane. This includes anything produced through unattended processes like automatic assembly lines. This is a setting where a level 15 swordsmith can fashion weapons out of unobtainium and a level 15 artificer is enchanting those weapons to the extent that they can slice through modern MBTs. The crafting and enchantment systems of the New World are capable of producing things that are absolutely impossible for industrial automation to match. Is there a place for industrialization as we know it? Sure, because a +10 adamantite train of hedonistic pleasure is not required for everyday logistical operations. But people will always remain on top when it comes to high-quality goods and services, as well as in menial labor that benefits from job class levels. Job class levels simply offer benefits that no mundane technology can replicate. Thus, slavery remains competitive in the New World, especially in places where the institution can consistently produce excellent slaves. How those slaves are produced and slave economies are maintained also differ from society to society. The realms below. Florine's little trip to Karzanar is our first real taste of what is colloquially known as the realms below. Basically, it's the Underdark that you find in many fantasy settings. Since Valkyrie's shadow always presents things from a kingdom-building perspective, however, certain realities that come with a vast, subterranean realm are explored when they otherwise wouldn't. First of all, it's huge. If the surface is a house, the realms below is a skyscraper that extends to the stratosphere. Of course, not all of it is open space, but there's still plenty of it and some things can just live in and travel through solid rock. Something more subtle about Florine's journey is that it shows us many of the more mystical processes that drive the New World. Photosynthesis is not available and chemosynthesis is too inefficient to support what we see. The primal energies of the world are no longer obfuscated by the mundanities of the surface. Life, death, and elemental forces give rise to extraordinary supernatural ecosystems, teeming populations, and extremely powerful beings. We'll be back in the realms below at some point in the future, but, hopefully, this taste of it will help readers be more aware of the magnitude by which the mystical elements of the New World influence its myriad of environments. The gazers. A few people correctly guessed right away that they're beholders. It's a sort of running joke in fantasy writing, both in Japanese light novels and Western fantasy, to have some form of these copyrighted fellows floating around. Gazers are what many people seem to think dragons are. In terms of personality, at least. They are the ultimate tyrant that each believes they are the pinnacle of perfection, possessing pride, avarice, narcissism, and evil in spades. Every gazer is also some degree of insane, as the two halves of their brain are each individually cognizant and usually plotting against the other half. They're bona fide aberrations whose biology is almost entirely magical. They have unlimited eye powers, have a palate that revolves around visually stimulating things, and they usually reproduce by dreaming other gazers into existence. When they die, they only leave a boulder behind. Probably the only thing that prevents gazers from taking over the world or going spelljamming is the fact that they're continually killing each other in an endless battle to prove themselves the true perfect being. Mechanical thoughts. This section is more of a bit of housekeeping. I thought I'd explore the statistical difference between various classes and how this is practically applied to the setting. The topic has been visited several times in previous volumes, but a certain portion of it that I sort of took for granted seems to have caused some confusion in power comparisons. That portion is the stats of a level 0 humanoid. Just because a character doesn't have any levels yet doesn't mean that they don't have any stats. Life would be terrifying if babies just collapsed into piles of jelly because they had no strength or constitution. Yes, those stats exist in Overlord, see Volume 10. Every humanoid has a stat array aside from what they receive from job class levels. This stat array is based on age, sex, genetics and overall physical fitness. To put it simply, a level 0 human is the statistical equivalent of a normal human on Earth. Of course, as Overlord is a power fantasy, The big question is how this factors into versus battles. It's fairly simple, but let's go through some examples to try to make it perfectly clear. I'll be using nice round numbers for simplicity's sake. Initial stats have a pretty big impact on how one starts out. We'll look at the average level 0 female human teenager first. We'll call her Jolene. Like 95% of the population, Jolene was born in a rural village. Chores around the farm keep her pretty active and she doesn't suffer from any long periods of malnutrition. Her base physical parameters look like this: 80 strength, 90 dexterity, 100 constitution, 100 horsepower. Next, we'll take a level 0 male human teenager in the same situation. We'll call him Joe. His base physical parameters look like this: 90 strength, 80 dexterity, 100 constitution, 100 horsepower. For the sake of this example, we'll also make a clone of Joe and call him Joe. He will go on a different career path. Now, we'll take Ludmilla. As a level 0 teenager, she's already the equivalent of a super athlete with her Uber bloodlines, highly fit frontier lifestyle, and awesome diet. Her base physical parameters look like this: 120 strength, 140 dexterity, 130 constitution, 130 horsepower. Even at level 0, she and her brothers stand clearly above the average civilian, but not so much that they'd be considered monsters. Why is that? Well, let's see what happens as they gain levels. In Overlord, civilian job classes only confer 20% to 50% of the physical stats of a combat job class. We'll assume the bog standard fighter here. We'll also assume that the high end of the spread goes to physically demanding vocations while the low end goes to professions that barely see any physical strain. Upon reaching adulthood, Jolene marries a childhood friend from the same village and continues life on the farm. She gets a farmer level. Farming is a physically demanding vocation, though probably not as physically demanding as being a miner. We'll say that it gets 40% of the stats of a fighter, and that a fighter grows by 10 STR/Dex/Con/HP per level. That means level 1 farmer Jolene's stats now look like this: 84 STR, 94 Dex, 104 Con, 104 horsepower. Relatively speaking, she only gets a little bit more powerful compared to before. She can do a little bit more work, lift a bit more, and screws up a bit less. Maybe she gains access to a job class ability that lets her dig up weeds twice as fast as before, though, to her village, this is just a normal thing. Joe, on the other hand, is a spare and gets kicked out of the house shortly after reaching adulthood. He still gained a level in farmer, however, so his stats look like this: 94 STR, 84 Dex, 104 Con, 104 horsepower. Again, nothing spectacular. Pretty much no one takes any note of it because it's just a part of growing up. In our world, on the other hand, people would be asking what the fuck you're doing to achieve that. Joe's clone Joe, however, was a rebellious kid and ran away to become an adventurer. He trains in whatever scuffed ways he can and becomes a level 1 fighter. His stats look like this: 100 STR, 90 Dex, 110 Con, 110 horsepower. As you can see, Joe is statistically not too far off from Joe. If they got into a fight, Farmer Joe actually has a not terrible chance of beating Fighter Joe. Assuming their equipment was the same, of course. The above comparison is the reason why places like Riestais with their extremely low average levels end up with leaders that think that a levy is sufficient to win against a professional army. A low-level civilian is statistically not very far off from a low-level soldier. If you muster 200,000 levied civilians with spears against 60,000 low-level soldiers and have elites that keep the enemy elites in check, you will undoubtedly win. Now, we'll move on to Ludmilla. She gets her first level in Noble Fighter. Noble Fighter is a fighter prestige class and she also has a Genius modifier for it. Her stats now look like this: 134 STR, 154 Dex, 144 Con, 144 horsepower. These are just her physical parameters. In addition, all of her elite training starts to kick in and she's stabbing way above her weight. Her iconic figure is the romantic ideal for nobles who believe in their inherent superiority over the common folk. Except, they're civilian nobles and more like Fighter Joe than Ludmilla Zaradnik. They have a privileged upbringing, but not the uber bloodlines that they think they do, and definitely not noble fighter genius. Let's fast forward a bit now and see how they're doing 4 levels later. Jolene has a challenging life as a farmer and has also raised 3 children. Since humans have no racial class levels, she doesn't get any experience for that. Mundane tasks in general don't give much experience, if any at all. As a result, she just piles on those farmer levels. Now, her stats look like this: 100 STR, 110 Dex, 120 Con, 120 horsepower. She can beat most of the young men in the village in an arm wrestling contest and is a generally terrifying mom as she waves her wooden spoon around. As a farmer, she's gained the ability to mysteriously produce a 5% larger harvest as well as improved crop resilience against drought and disease, which has added a bit of luxury to her life. Overall, she's seen as a success and is a respected figure in the village circle. Since she lives an ordinary life, however, she'll maybe get 1 more level before she dies of old age. In terms of adventurer difficulty rating, she'd be about 4, which is above the national average of 3. After toiling as a laborer for a while, Joe manages to land a job as a weaver. He's just barely getting by in town. He and his wife struggle to make ends meet and provide for their single child. His levels are as follows: 1 farmer, 4 tailor. Tailor is on the lower end of the stats spread for production classes, so his physical parameters look like this: 102 STR, 92 Dex, 112 Con, 112 horsepower. If he had the means, he could try for Master Tailor, but the owner of his workshop is a jealous arsehole, so he's just stuck as a regular weaver. Additionally, while he has several tailoring skills/abilities, build contamination keeps him from getting a signature ability at level 5. Sucks for him. In terms of adventurer difficulty rating, Joe is a 3. Looking at this from a societal angle, you can see that men are still stronger than women at this level even when the woman is in a profession with more favorable stat growth. The average level in Reasties is even lower than this, allowing for gender role shenanigans to ensue despite being in a universe where levels determine stats. Adventurer Joe has managed to elude death and is now an iron rank adventurer. He has continued plugging on as a boring vanilla fighter, but he feels that it's finally paid off as he senses that he can start figuring out his first martial art. Due to his informal, haphazard training, however, grasping martial arts may be a long way off even if he does already have a focus level. His stats now look like this: 140 STR, 130 Dex, 150 Con, 150 horsepower. Even without his iron tag, people can see that this man has stepped beyond the realm of the everyday human. 3 level 1 farmers with spears can still easily kill him, however. Or just a rando that puts an arrow in his head. Helmets are important. In terms of adventurer difficulty rating, Joe is a 15. This is also the average strength of a regular Imperial Knight, though their equipment is far better than his. Now, for comparison's sake, let's take a look at a civilian Tiger Beastman from Roland Gork. The average demi-human has double the physical parameters as humans from their racial class levels, so while a level 2 Tiger Beastman tailor's build looks like this: 1 Tiger Folk, 1 Tailor. Their physical stats look like this: 182 Strength, 162 Dexterity, 202 Constitution, 202 Horsepower. In terms of adventurer difficulty rating, this kitty is a 30. He comes with natural weapons and armor, too. Life is fucking pain for humans in the new world. Now, we'll take a look at Ludmilla. For my sanity's sake, we'll say that she didn't get any ranger levels as she would normally have in her situation. 190 STR, 210 Dex, 200 Constitution, 200 Horsepower. At level 5, her fantasy genetics-driven head start gifts her with the stats of a high silver rank adventurer. New Worlders don't have any concept of levels, so she'd simply be hailed as a prodigy or something and the marriage proposals from the local noble houses would be flooding in. A wealth of martial arts from her childhood training regimen are just waiting to be unlocked and she'd be considered difficulty rating 33 by adventurer standards. Hopefully, this helps to illustrate how power differences work in this setting. The level 0 human stat array creates a situation where it can be very difficult to discern the physical gap between people in places like Reasties, where the average level is extremely low. Being a fighter doesn't necessarily guarantee a win against a farmer at those levels, and multiple opponents are highly likely to result in a single fighter losing. At higher levels, higher bracket classes have much bigger stats, which basically makes these starting nuances a non-thing. Too bad the average level cap for humans in the New World is 15. Other notable takeaways from this exercise would be just how ridiculously disadvantaged humans are in this low-level setting, as well as the fact that, while racial levels are strong, any standard job class levels that demi-humans and heteromorphs get give the same stat growth to them as they would to a human. This makes racial prestige classes like Illusionists or PDLs an absolute necessity if one doesn't want to gimp themselves relative to other members of their species that leveled a pure build. The rise of the Diplomancer. This is another mechanical commentary, this time regarding skill checks and how they work in Valkyrie's shadow, which is also how they appear to work in Overlord canon. For those who are unaware, a skill check is basically a number that one has to beat to make a specific skill work on other characters. To be clear, these skills are not the same as Yggdrasil's skills, which are activated attacks and special abilities, but things like climbing, swimming, stealth, deception, intimidation, wilderness lore, metalworking, and so on. These checks happen constantly throughout Valkyrie's shadow, though every check, regardless of success or failure, is written in a narratively plausible way. In Overlord, many of those checks are purposely written to be noticed to indicate that it's part of the New World systems. The most well-known of these are various NPCs wearing masks that somehow perfectly deceive observers, Ainz spouting random bullshit to New Worlder natives and they quickly agree with it, and also Ainz just failing to learn anything that doesn't mesh with his build, like ruling a country populated by the living or learning new languages. Every skill-related action has a specific difficulty, which is abstracted as a number to beat in the skill check. Many games, from TTRPGs to MMOs, use some variant of this system. Most probably know it as resource node requires X skill to harvest or recipe requires Y skill to craft, or you have a 95% chance to succeed at this action, and then you fail and die. In D20 systems, a 20-sided die is rolled and the result is added to a character's related skill rank to determine success or failure. Additionally, related stats for that skill add to or subtract from that score. People with high charisma are more persuasive and vice versa. Those with better endurance can swim for longer, high dexterity makes delicate tasks easier, etc. The difficulty of the skill check itself is determined either by how reasonable the action is or how high the target's opposing skill is, e.g. hide versus spot. Environmental factors also influence things like stealth. As a basic example, a rogue gets caught pickpocketing by a city guard. They can 1. Tell a believable lie to a common guard to mitigate the repercussions, and the difficulty of doing so would be 10. 2. Tell an outrageous lie to a common guard to get oneself off the hook entirely, which has a difficulty of 20. 3. Convince the common guard that the perpetrator was actually the guard standing next to him, which has a difficulty of 50. If one simply rolled the d20, they'd have a 50-50 chance of getting away with it. Option B would require extreme luck. C is impossible. Rogues, however, can put points in their deception skill. A level 6 rogue with 10 points in their deception skill can get away with option A pretty much every time and pull off option B half of the time. Option C is still impossible. This is where the silliness with skill checks in Overlord canon comes in. If one puts on a mask with plus 50 in deception in a place where the average character level is 3, basically no one can tell who they are even if everything else about them is the same as the person they saw just a few seconds before. As long as they don't see them put on or take off the mask, of course. Character level does not necessarily matter in a skill check, and there are usually ways to get around hard ones. For instance, sneaking by a ranger pits their detection skills against your stealth skills, but you can take their detection skills out of the picture entirely by convincing them to not be around at all, lying about trouble elsewhere, saying that someone's asking for them, etc. Suddenly, they have to sense your motives instead of thwarting your stealth, which is usually far harder for a ranger to do, resulting in a much easier skill check. We see Ainz do this all the time in canon, asking questions or dragging people into debates that are out of their character build's depth, resulting in easier skill checks. The fact that he tends to always employ attractive or irrefutable vehicles in his interactions also drastically lowers that difficulty. This is not because he's a nice guy or a persuasive individual, but because he can do what he says and no one can stop him. The narrative, of course, will always offer a plausible line of logic, as doing so is a fundamental literary component of gamelit. In Japanese light novels, the plausible logic always seems to either be some form of stupidity or a trope. By the way, successful skill checks cannot be resisted. They can only be thwarted by opposing skills or the sheer difficulty of the task. In the same way that Ainz can influence others, he can, too, be influenced. Much of the doormat effect and the strangely smooth interactions that go on between characters in Overlord may be attributed to this. Someone succeeds at a skill check and things just go their way until someone else opposes that skill check. The latter usually doesn't happen because those that can act in opposition to a plot usually aren't aware of it or not present at all. That brings us to the Diplomancer. Rather than a specific class, Diplomancer is a term coined for builds that focus on getting ludicrously high ranks in diplomacy-related skills in order to succeed in every skill check that a campaign can throw at them. In a low-level setting like the Irantal region of the New World, diplomacy-related skill checks would range from 5 to 50, with the vast majority being 10 or lower. The Diplomancer, however, is running around with 100 ranks in persuasion/deception/intimidation through a min-maxed combination of race/class/feat/trait selections. At level 5. And, then, they just go around boobing everyone, as Leanne would say. They can ask people to carry their stuff for them, and they will. They can tell people to give up their possessions, and they will. Telling people to kill themselves is not out of the question, nor is convincing a god to surrender their godhood to them. There are countermeasures against diplomancers, of course, but they're rare in the primitive backwaters of the New World. Though nowhere near as extreme as the above-mentioned example, Florian Gagne is a diplomancer. Unlike the Munchkin min-maxing their character to metagame their way through a campaign, however, Florian Gagne is a real person in a real world. Thus, she's basically a hardcore role-player diplomancer. Her moral compass, sense of duty and responsibility, and her personal and societal values are what stops her from just doing whatever she wants to and getting away with it. We see a lot of that in Stone and Blood, not to mention in previous volumes. Florian very rarely unleashes her powers on those around her, preferring to work out real, lasting solutions. Like her friends, she does her utmost to stay within the bounds of her duties. She does lose her temper once, however, though even then the result was extremely mild. I'm sure that more than a few people lost patience with Florian's patience somewhere along the way, but, well, Florian is something like an anti-power fantasy character. How will she develop from here? That's a long story, one that I hope everyone will enjoy. Next up. There have been rumblings of this for a while, with a handful of chapters to whet the appetite. Now, we're at the point in the Overlord timeline where we can jump right in. The next volume of Valkyrie's Shadow is The Paladin of the Holy Kingdom, Part 3. We'll be following Liam and Say as they head back to the Holy Kingdom of Roble to help push Phase 2 of Demiurge's plans. For those that somehow haven't yet, please consider helping Valkyrie's Shadow out on Roll Road by leaving an awesome rating or review. The bots are still bombing this story on a regular basis and downvoting every positive review while upvoting all of the negative ones. This has been going on for nearly 2 years now, so it's a constant battle to keep the story afloat since a series on the site can only be rated once by one account no matter how long it is. Once again, thank you very much for reading Valkyrie's Shadow, and I hope you continue to enjoy the story.